Louis Kelso. Mr. Kelso is, in the minds of many, the economist. He's defining a new economics that has incredible implications in terms of the American, Western, and world economies. And Louis Kelso, once again, welcome very, very much to Conversations Indeed.
Pleasure to be here, Harold.
We've entitled the program The Economics of Reality, and you had entitled your book, Two-Factor Theory, The Economics of Reality.
What it does, Harold, is to highlight the fact that in a very real and practical sense, economics as a valid discipline hasn't begun yet. Well, believe it or not, it is the concept of economists, as I say, past and present, that there's only one way to legitimately earn income. We simply say there are two. There is no resemblance between one-factor economics and the economics of reality, which I will call two-factor economics. The conventional wisdom, that scoffing term for people who pretend to be wise and are wrong, holds that the only legitimate way for individuals to acquire income is through the employment of their labor power, the powers of their bodies and mind. It's our position that not only can one earn income that way, it's our position that one can and does earn income through his privately owned capital. Land, structures, machines, certain intangibles that are given by law or custom. Since most of the assets in the American economy are owned by corporations, the form that ownership of capital takes is the ownership of stock. The common law defines property in producer goods as a bundle of rights, including the right to possess, to use, to lease, to subdivide, even to destroy if you want to. Today, the typical owner, the stockholder, on the average, receives about 1/12 of the income that the assets that he beneficially owns produces. That when we speak of the income earning power of capital, we're talking about something that is 12 times greater than it appears.
Oh, right.
12 times as powerful. To say it another way, the income that a $500,000 capital estate would earn for you under that attenuated property arrangement, you could receive from a mere $47,000 investment if you got what it really produced.
Right.
Ownership of the second factor of production. Because what I've done is to say the ownership of capital by an individual is a way of earning income. If he got the wages of his capital fully, would be a full-fledged capital worker. We're talking about ways in which people, human beings, citizens, as defined in the United States Constitution, ways in which citizens engage or can engage in production.
Yes.
We were an economic democracy in 1776 when we took the first steps into political democracy. Economic power, on the other hand, is nothing more nor less than the power to produce goods and services. That is economic power. So that in 1776, everyone had economic power because labor was the main source and everyone was born with it. Economic power was democratically diffused throughout the society. But if the input of capital workers were measured in comparison to the input of labor workers, we would find that between 1776 and 1983, for example, that the two forms of input, labor workers versus capital workers, have roughly changed places.
Switched, yeah.
Capital workers provide at least 90% of the input and 10% from labor. Now look at the mess we've gotten into.
That's right.
Look at the mess we've gotten into. If this is accurate, and so help me, Hannah, it's accurate, we have the great bulk of the people, 95% of them, providing a mere 10% of the productive input. And you have a mere 5% of the people who own all the productive capital providing 90% of the productive input. In 1930, and particularly beginning in 1932, we embarked on a program which was later called the War on Poverty, but this is what Roosevelt was really talking about. A war on poverty, which meant a war on the effects of poverty, not on poverty, war on the effects of poverty. In 1946, we officially adopted the one-factor economic policy. Congress got together and said, we want to leave no doubt about this subject. There is only one way to earn income. Employment Act of 1946. Now, pursuant to the War on Poverty and to the Employment Act of 1946, and using the tools of coercive trickle-down, those are primarily implemented by labor under the policy of the National Labor Relations Act and all the other labor apparatus, under which labor simply makes an assault on the market value of labor power. They demand more and more pay for the same work.
Or less.
Or what's worse, they demand more and more pay for less work. So we've rigged the price of labor. We have used the coercive power of taxation to rip income away from people who earn it. We're trying to hide the fact that when the few produce for the many become parasites. As the most momentous implications under the American Constitution that you can imagine. You can't talk about the right of citizens to earn income in the way in which goods and services are actually produced, or through the tools that they're actually produced today, if you don't recognize that capital workers earn income at all.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is they're operating on a set of facts that is unreal. It has no relation to the world. The conventional wisdom holds that a capital instrument acts essentially like a catalytic agent.
Yes, right.
A catalytic agent, or some kind of a magic device. You put the capital down in the vicinity of the workers, and somehow or other invisible signals go back and forth between those things, and it raises the productivity of the workers who work in the vicinity of it but don't own it.
Right.
Now, of course, all this is simply fraud done with statistics.
And
what they do is measure the output caused by two input factors and attribute it to the wrong one. And why do they do that? Because they want an excuse and a justification to constantly pay labor more and more for less and less, instead of enabling people to become literally and actually productive in the way in which goods and services is produced. Nobody likes to be a host and earn income, have it taken away from him, to support strangers. I mean, to someone you love, that's another matter, but that's not what the question is. And no red-blooded American wants to be a parasite in any sense of the word. And if he knew his constitutional rights, he would like it even less, because the Constitution tells him, you've got a right to be productive. The right to life with liberty, which is proclaimed by the prologue to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and by the Constitution itself, The right to life with liberty is meaningless if it doesn't mean you are entitled to the power to earn. Not only are there two ways to earn income, but that the whole thrust of science is to make the capital worker endlessly and progressively more productive, because capital takes the place of labor. Or if it doesn't take the place of it, it at least produces more. The system is totally out of control in that by endlessly building ownership into those who can't use it. We sterilize it on the one hand, and we deprive the system of the tools that it has to have to live. Let's take the case of housing. There was no moment in the history of the world prior to this one when we had the massive capability of building houses of the highest quality, the greatest beauty, the greatest durability, and the lowest cost to right now. And yet,
look at the
great bulk of people who once could have had houses can't have them anymore.
Why?
For the very simple reason that coerced trickle-down economics packs the wage base with welfare and inflates the prices, and relying on labor input, even though it's jiggered, in other words, even though it's enormously exaggerated, it still isn't enough to take what is produced primarily by capital off the market. Those who have only their labor power and its precarious value held up by this coercive rigging, and who desperately need capital ownership to enable them to be capital workers as well as labor workers, can't do it. So on the one hand, we've pushed the price of housing through the ceiling. On the other hand, we put the income in people who don't already have too many houses. Why did they want more and more pay for the same work or less work? Perfectly simple. The system doesn't give them access to capital ownership. In a world in which technology is shifting the burden of production off labor off labor workers onto capital workers, every man needs to have access to capital ownership so that he can buy capital and pay for it out of what the capital produces. I believe nature intended us to shift the burden of production off labor workers onto capital workers. The more difficult it becomes to earn a living, the more people focus on it.
Yes, right.
And that's natural. If the U.S. economy continues to encourage and promote technological advance, which it must, and continues to distribute the resulting income, see which under Say's law goes to those who earn it, those who produce, we would ravage our currency with inflation, and we would turn over our markets to foreigners. Not because the foreigners are necessarily smarter than we are, but because they are, in general, about 10 or 15 years behind us on the road going in the wrong direction. What needs to be adjusted is the opportunity to produce, not the redistribution of income after it's produced. By the way, Aesop, I think, Aesop's fables, Aesop has that law worked out better than I think anyone else. Aesop said it all when he said, you can give meat to a tiger, but you can't take it away from him. Now that's why redistribution doesn't work in the American economy. Why finance tends to make the rich ever richer and to keep the poor, and I define anyone without a viable capital estate as poor. We found out, but everyone knows this once you examine it, it just hadn't been examined, that credit to buy capital, the thing Kuznets was talking about, as the essence of finance. Credit to buy capital is made available to only to people who already own capital.
Who don't need it.
Relatively speaking, who don't need it.
Right.
And it is clinically denied with a snarl and a glance down the bridge of some banker's nose,
Yes.
to those who need it. You can't imagine a more perverse
I know.
arrangement. Capital formation takes place on the logic of self-financing. That is to say, people buy capital instruments with the expectation that they will pay for themselves.
They'd better. It'd be a bad business investment if they didn't.
Well, from the very beginning, man's tool making would have lowered his standard of living.
Right.
And frankly, as you know, he was not able to afford it. He was living like an animal to begin with.
Yeah, right out of the... Yeah.
Self-financement, or auto-financement, as the Germans call it, is the logic of capital acquisition. You buy capital if you think it will pay for itself in a reasonable period of time in operation, and the rule of thumb in general in business, except in the throes of a severe depression, which we're in and which we will never escape from until we change the economic policy, was 3 to 5 years. It's probably longer than that, more like 5 to 7 or 8 years today. Now, there is nevertheless a risk that it might not pay for itself, called the feasibility risk. In the whole of business, the handling of risk is done by commercial insurance. And this is the normal way. Ask any insurance man, he'll tell you we'd still be in the Stone Age if it weren't for commercial insurance.
Right, yeah.
Because you couldn't build anything very valuable.
Couldn't you? Yeah, right.
And take the risk that one wipe out and you're finished forever.
Right, you spread that out, right.
Yeah, spread over a wide base. But the most important business risk of all, because it determines whether labor workers can become capital workers in an industrialized society. In other words, it depends upon whether the constitutional rights of man to his life with liberty are going to be satisfied or not. That risk, that vital, horribly important risk, we have only used self-insurance. In other words, you start a new business, costs $1 million, a banker likes it, he likes the studies and all, he says, I'll finance it. He's not telling you he'll loan you $1 million. He's telling you he'll loan you 2/3 of a million, or maybe 3/4. The rest is self-insurance. Self-insurance is a crude, primitive, obsolete way of insuring the business risk of feasibility.
Yeah, and then with that backed up with collateralization, which even, it'll just...
Well, that is a form of self-insurance, collateralization, mortgages and what have you.
Yeah.
Now, what's needed, obviously, is a reasonably modern way of risk management in finance. The risk needs to be commercially insured or broadly insured so that it doesn't constantly build capital ownership into the already rich where it is sterilized and is no use to the consumer economy and denies it to the poor who must firstly suffer. God knows the horror that this kind of stupid finance has inflicted on the world. It is so immeasurable that it's almost useless to talk about.
Particularly frustrating, you can see alternatives that
yes, of
can
course.
be put in place as you worked out. Yeah.
Now, the ESOP, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, was the first tool that I invented. I actually invented it before the publication of the Capitalist Manifesto. Simply because I'm revolted by the thought of putting forward an idea that can't be implemented. I think as a form of chicanery. The ESOP is a device, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. There are actually thousands of things called ESOPs, but most of them are counterfeits. But there are a good many real ESOP, real financing devices that enable them, that give employees access to credit so that they can buy the employer's stock, pay for it out of the assets that underlie that stock, and after it's paid for, earn it, collect the wages of it, accumulate it in a tax haven until they retire, and where used efficiently and intensively, when they retire from being labor workers, they continue to be capital workers, and they can go on to their dying day totally self-sufficient. I'm speaking of the ideal case now,
right,
because we've got to use it more intensively than we do.
Yes, right.
But the object of the game is really lifetime employment. That's what the thing is all about.
Right.
From the time that you leave your family, get your education, you should begin to be, and thereafter forever be until your dying day, self-sufficient, needing no redistribution, no food stamps, no welfare, no charity, no social security, no pensions, no profit sharing, none of that stuff, which is largely designed to promote the stock market. You know, they churn around and gamble in second-hand securities that have very little value to the individual because their yield is 5 or 6%, always below the rate of inflation, except when you're trying to control inflation with a severe depression. How long
as they increasingly seem to do.
Yeah, how long the American people are going to stand still for that, I think is one of the more interesting speculations.
So we could begin to build an economic democracy to go along with the avowed and in real terms political democracy that we have. We need to have them working in tandem in order to have the country move into a really appropriate new kind of future that we can see.
About a year ago, I gave some testimony before Senator Mark Hatfield's Senate Appropriations Committee. The title of it was The Right to be Productive.
Yes.
And what that does is marshal the constitutional law case for access to capital ownership. And of course, at the moment, the ESOP is the best way to do it. There are 7 other techniques built on the same logic. Some of them have been partially legislatively implemented. Most haven't. But what's needed, of course, is simply for Congress to say, let's abandon the outmoded and false economic policy that there's only one way to earn an income. Now, I testified very extensively before the Joint Economic Committee back in 1975 when Hubert Humphrey was chairman.
Yes.
And at the conclusion of that testimony, and in the annual report of the Joint Economic Committee, which comes out with the President's Economic Report in January of each year, in the Joint Economic Committee report in January of 1976, the committee recommended to the Congress that they change the economic policy to a 2-factor policy.
Marvelous. I mean,
would be marvelous, except Congress never paid any attention.
But it has been taken on and seen by people who can see the vision and the logic and the appropriateness of that, that it might be that we could consider collectively as a society a major policy direction or a major policy shift that would allow us to meet some of the major economic problems individually, in an industrial corporate sense, and collectively, and that the kernel of that would be the economics 2-factor theory or the economics of reality that you've been putting forward.
The reason economics doesn't work is that it starts from the wrong facts. From there on, it is terribly easy to cure it. About a month ago, some of the world's most highly respected economists met on David Rockefeller's estate up in New York, Pocantico. And they shook their heads and they said, none of the economic theories around the world are working. None. We must set out to find out why. And the Nobel Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, or one of the Rockefeller Foundations, indicated that they would back it. And now these fine gentlemen are going to set off on a great economic boondoggle, and whatever the appropriated funds are, they won't find the answer before they've used those. But they're looking for that other little fact
Well, isn't it good that they're doing that? That there's initiative being taken toward the idea of trying to understand in a broad...
I think it's kind of pitiful that you have to do it. I did it 20 years ago.
Right,
what the hell are they talking about?
Why don't they just call you in and put you...
or why doesn't somebody step up and say, here, gentlemen, is the answer.
Right.
Give me half the $3 million, you take the rest, and we'll save all that boring reading and stuff.
Yeah, right. Well, it is encouraging that it is encouraging, in fact, if we look at that, as we look through the conundrums that are confronting us all, as we look at these, that there are solutions, given a certain analysis, given a certain perspective.
It's more than that. These solutions are working.
They're working now.
We're buying some of the very large corporations in the U.S. economy for their employees.
Yeah, it's beginning to happen right now without a big policy statement on the part of Congress. There could be a change of the Full Employment or the Employment Act of 1946. You at one time had thought a Production Act, Full Production Act of
yes. Well, you can call it anything you want.
Yeah.
What it needs is a recognition that we should deliberately begin to broaden the capital ownership base. We should do it consistently with the laws of property, with the constitutional safeguards, but not just the constitutional safeguards of property, but also the constitutional safeguards of the rights of man. We talk about human rights. The right to be productive is the #1 human right. If there's one more important than that, is simply the right not to be killed.
Yeah, right.
On the spot.
Yeah, that's right. And that we could have that kind of a direction toward which we're going is one, and despite the fact that these, let's say in a certain sense, legislative initiatives to change the basic policy structure, to have a generally accepted notion that there could be a dispersal of income, access to credit in order to purchase capital instruments that will pay for themselves, applying the business logic finance to the general citizenry as a method of income distribution, which could also provide for greater capital formation.
I've worked out the details.
You've got the details worked out.
It's terribly simple.
Right. Yeah.
Simply use the Federal Reserve Bank to monetize each transaction determined by the same expertise that determines it today. Firstly, management, secondly, banks. That it's feasible, but with no risk in the Federal Reserve Bank at all. All they do is monetize the transaction. As our last diagram there indicates, the first layer of risk would be taken by the commercial insurers, but to make certain that that they feel safe and comfortable, and that they will be backed up, there needs to be one new institution, the Capital Diffusion Reinsurance Corporation, a government corporation that insurance companies could lay off part or all the risk if they want to. And of course, when you lay off risk, you lay off premiums, so you don't do that unless you think you can't make money at it. I guess the most momentous question you can ask about that risk is, why would the federal government do a thing like that? I mean, why would it step up and say, well, these enterprises that have been determined to be feasible, if they aren't feasible, why should Uncle insure them? The answer is Uncle insures them anyway. In the last half century has always insured them. Not in that form. If a business fails and people are unemployed and hungry, government picks them up. And government is expected to pick them up. There's no doubt about that.
Why don't we...
The difference is that today government does it without any assurance that the risks to individuals are locked into, rigidly and contractually locked into an expansion of production. As this diagram shows, with each financing, it's determined to be feasible and it's determined to be self-liquidating.
Right.
Except for a little risk of feasibility. Insurers have calculated that risk. If it's very big, it will be said to be not feasible and it won't be financed. Well, hell, that goes on every day anyway.
And this would be, in a certain sense, I'm terribly sorry, we're running short on time here, but this would be, in a certain sense, a final assurance to the overall system and the forward movement of the production of the economy as we begin to move ahead, underpinning these approaches and institutional structurings that you've talked of, is entirely keeping that a Congress or a governmental legislative organization might well do that.
It's simply providing the commercial insurance of something that has been self-insured, and that's its evil.
Yeah, right. Well,
right. What it does for the third world, as you can see, is to eliminate the necessity for savings financing. Okay. They don't have to look abroad for savings.
Okay, that's right. Now
that's perhaps the most critical thing at the moment.
Well, that's going to have to wait for another program. I'm terribly sorry, we're running right out of time. But may I just really say thank you again, Louis. It's been a great pleasure being with you. It's been a pleasure for you in the cable audience to have had the perceptions of Louis Kelso, author of An Economic System of incredible import to the Western world economy. Thanks again very, very much for participating. We'll invite you to tune in again next week. I'm sorry, we're running right out of time. That's it for this week. And once again, Louis, thank you very, very much indeed for everything.
Let's take the case of housing. There was no moment in the history of the world prior to this one when we had the massive capability of building houses of the highest quality, the greatest beauty, the greatest durability, and the lowest cost. And yet, great bulk of people who once could have had houses can't have them anymore.